To the Middle East tonight, while the region braces for a retaliatory strike from Iran on Israel, the Israeli military now confirms it killed another Hamas commander in Lebanon.
General, people should understand how this ends has everything to do with if it starts up again. Everybody wants the hostages out, but if you leave Hamas intact, it's only going to be worse the next time. And if you read the Institute for the Study of War that you put out every day, it reveals what is really going on.
There's also uncertainty about how the dozens of Iranian proxy groups will respond. Earlier this week, Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah called the groups an axis and said they will coordinate their attacks on Israel. And the Houthi leader followed up with similar remarks yesterday.
Our
operations to target the Israeli enemy, as well as coordination with the Axis in any joint operations, is a decision by everyone.
And the IDF is still targeting those proxies. On Friday, they took out a senior Hamas commander in Lebanon with an airstrike.
What we are seeing is increased tension throughout the region and really signs of escalation at the moment between Israel and Hamas, Hezbollah and Iran. And right now, it's hard to kind of see the light in those negotiations.
So, Daryl, can these talks even really play out amid just the continued Israeli strikes and the ensuing threats of revenge?
But you see, the Bible, which predates the Quran by 1,000 years, tells us an opposite story. It says in Genesis 21, Isaac is the son through whom your descendants will be counted. This ancient hostility is fomented by Satan, and it brews within the pits of hell to create the most virulent kind of anti-Semitism, whose ultimate goal is the genocide of the Jewish people, and not simply stopping with the destruction of Israel, but the genocide of the Jews, who they view as, in a very Hitlerian way, they're not really people, they're vermin. This is why Nazism and Islam, radical Islam, merge together so well. You see, you have to understand there's nothing logical, rational, reasonable about such virulent hatred.
Cameron, does Israel have the defenses to be able to defend themselves on three separate fronts?
An excellent question. I think at the end of the day, they do. Israel is also facing quite a bit of resources because of Iran having access to finances and the buildup of different military infrastructure in Lebanon and other areas. But their military in Israel is very unique to most. The integration between the different armed services, their aviation wings, their boots on the ground, as well as a lot of their advanced technology to improve the effort of the warfighter is quite remarkable. It's unlike any other nation in the world, second to the United States. So I think they can take on most enemies that are at least 5 to 10 times their size. And they've done it time and time again.
Yeah, it's a powerful nation.
When he says in chapter 12, this is the word of the Lord concerning Israel, I'm going to make Jerusalem a cup that sends all the surrounding peoples reeling. Judah will be besieged as well as Jerusalem. And on that day when all the nations of the earth are gathered against her, I will make Jerusalem an immovable rock for all the nations. And all who try to move it will injure themselves. How strange that a small, relatively insignificant nation in the middle of a relatively unimportant part of the world could become the epicenter of world events, so much that all the world would be troubling themselves about it. For Jesus to say that 2,000 years ago, or Zechariah to say it 2,700 years ago, you say, man, that guy is a great guesser. And he should play the lottery. Because it's just incalculable. Yet despite repeated efforts by world powers over the last 70 years to resolve the conflict between the surrounding nations that he speaks of, Israel remains the number one flashpoint of international concern, even more than Ukraine. And we find historically from the time of Truman up to Biden, the Middle East problem not only remains, but it's part of what Jesus foretold. He said the nations would be distress and perplexity in those times. because there would be just wars and rumors of wars. When he said to Abraham at the very beginning of the genesis of the nation of Israel, he told Abraham regarding him and his descendants forever, he says, I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. When Jesus said in Matthew 25, when you refuse to help my brothers and sisters, you are refusing to help me. And there are people who are saying, well, they're not born again believers, but in Jeremiah 36, he said, I'm going to do this one more time. He said the whole great story, the valley of dry bones, dry, desiccated bones. He's talking about Israel being this destroyed and dead nation. We know one thing about dead people, they don't come back to life except once. And we know that when people have decayed to the point where there's no sinew, flesh, or anything else, just white bleached bones laying on the ground, we do not expect them to come back to life. And yet he said, Son of man, can these bones live? And he says, Lord, you know. And the Lord said, suddenly the Spirit of God began to move and they began to reconnect. And he said, suddenly there was a great nation of my people. And God foretold, I'm going to rebuild them. But he told them in the previous chapter, I'm not going to do it for your sake. I'm going to do it for my sake. I was talking to a young serviceman, Israeli IDF soldier one time, and I said, well, a lot of our soldiers are coming back from Iraq, and they're suffering from post-traumatic syndrome. And he started laughing. He said, in Israel, everybody has post-traumatic syndrome. We've been at war our entire lives. We don't know at what moment the woman standing next to me in the market is going to pull out a knife and throw it into my chest. Because when you have a whole generation of young boys and young girls who grow up and they're taught in their schools and in their textbooks that the Jews' favorite drink is Arab's blood, and that they kidnap Arab children and to get their fat so they can use it to create oil for their lamps. Think about that when you're told that over and again from the age where you first begin to read a book. Do you not grow up with just an incredible hatred for these vicious people? You have to understand, in the end times, the Lord said he would send a strong delusion that they would believe a lie. They would believe doctrines of demons. And so you feel a culture becomes inundated with this false information that doesn't just come from lazy journalists or people with a bent, twisted ideology. It comes again out of the very pits of hell. We fight again, not against flesh and blood, but against spiritual forces. So the day when we look at it, we find this is exactly what the Bible said would happen in the last days. Zechariah said, all the nations of the earth are gathered against her.
He is telling Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Iranian leadership that I'm going to finish this on my terms, and he is completely committed to it. I wish the administration was as committed as he is to the end state of this war. He knows he's got to finish off these thousands of fighters. If he leaves them in place as a result of a permanent ceasefire, Hamas wins, and they just bide their time before they reattack.
So we know that our fighter jets arrived right there in the Middle East. What's that symbolic of? And number two is, are we ever going to answer for the attack at our base in Iraq?
Well, you would have thought we would have answered by now. But after all, we're wringing our hands about not wanting to escalate. But did they escalate? Of course they did. And that's where we have been.